The Story of Olympia. It's a story about a place known for many things. It's the village once promoted as the Pearl of the Puget Sound. It's the town that oysters and water made famous. It's the capital city of Washington State. But more than anything else, Olympia is a place that people made great. So join us, won't you, in our Stories of Old Olympia. It's a tribute to our town's quiet heroes, the workers and the dreamers, the pioneers and the builders. They're all part of our story. They're all home folk. And while they don't always make headlines, they do make cities. And our city's a better place because of them.
Merry Christmas. I'm Joe Willing, your host for the Story of Olympia. This will be the 137th observance of Christmas in our town since Edmund Sylvester christened it Olympia in 1850. During that span of time, we've celebrated Christmas in times of optimism and economic prosperity and in times of depression and economic collapse. We've observed Christmas during times of peace and during times of war. There's been one thing consistent. Olympia knew how to celebrate Christmas in style. With us to look over that span, some of that span of time, we have some terrific people who have kept the spirit of Christmas alive in Olympia over the past few dozen years. For Christmas is truly a time of the spirit, a time of renewal, and it's a tradition that's kept alive by people. And this Story of Olympia is about people. With us today we have George Warren, printer to Olympia for many years, Gordon Newell, historian and entrepreneur and state patrolman for many years in Olympia, Judge Frank Baker, a judicial legend in Olympia, and Marianne Bigelow, keeper of the hearth at the Bigelow House. Welcome. Thanks for being with us. I thought we'd start with you, Marianne. We want to just remember Christmas in Olympia as it was, and I wanted to ask you about the very earliest of Christmases. What are some of your earliest recollections of Christmas in Olympia?
I go back 52 years, and I think the earliest remembrance of Christmas was the sound of the church bell. There was an old man named Mr. Townsend. I don't think he was any relation to Cap Townsend, and he was the bell ringer at the Methodist Church, to the point where he would go clear up with the rope, you know. But he was the bell ringer, and we'd hear the first bell at Christmas on Sunday or whatever day that Christmas would fall. And then the second bell, and we had to get down there. And I remember the first time every kid that came to the service got a sock full of candy. Remarkable. It was not a time when we had candy very easily. And it even had something very foreign to us. It was a Japanese orange in the toe. And we celebrated that. I can still smell it. They're so sharp. Remember how good they were?
They still are.
Yes.
Frank, how about you? How about some of your earliest recollections?
Well, I have two very special recollections, which are perhaps a little personal to me. When I was but 4, and that would have been in the 1920s, we lived on 18th Street, West 18th, and Morris's lived across from us, and that's M.M. Morris, who were in the women's clothing business here for many, many, many years, and were outstanding people here in the community. And the reason I remember that is they're having lived across the street from us. As I say, I was about 4, and all of a sudden it was getting on toward dawn, I assume. I was obviously asleep in my bed, as all good children should be at the time, when came a pounding on the door, and it was Mel Morris, Mr. Morris, asking for help. That they had 2 children, Jimmy and Lucy Jean, who succeeded in operation of the store ultimately. But anyway, their whole Christmas tree had fallen down. And it was getting on towards dawn, and those children were about to arise, you know. And so they rounded up my mother and my father. I stayed in bed because I didn't want to leave with Christmas coming so soon in the morning. And the folks went over and helped them get that tree put back together prior to the time that Morris's children got up. And I'll never forget that, because that started an annual Christmas Eve party, which became quite an institution here in the community and was conducted for many, many years after Mel and Irma Morris died, and then Lucy Jean had that the rest of her life. And it was always something that was just like practically going to church on Christmas Eve. It was something we all had to do. And of course my family was especially requested to be in attendance because of that initial time in 1924-5 when we helped them put the tree back together. So I remember that very clearly at this point. The other thing that I think is important is that I was a very close friend to whom we then called Buzzy Schmidt, which was Peter Schmidt Jr., and they lived out in the big old home by the brewery, now known as 3 Meter. And every Christmas they had an electric train that they had running in and about the tree, and all around, which was not unusual perhaps, but the track was at least that wide in width in gauge, and the cars were about this long and about this high. So it was an electric train of which I had never seen before, or the likes of which I had never seen before. And I remember that so clearly because the only time it was ever out was during the Christmas holidays, and then we would all go out into that living room of Peter Schmidt's and observe the operation of that train. So that is something that I remembered all these years likewise.
Gordon.
Well, I think the one that stands out in my mind probably proves that I'm basically a bah humbug type of guy, because it was a sort of a disaster. At the age of 6, I was enrolled in an educational institution known as Mr. Bruce's Musical Kindergarten. You didn't have free kindergartens. Your parents had to plungle up to get rid of you for a few hours a day. And my parents seemed to feel that it was money well invested. My sister, Dorothy, who's also a resident of the area to this day, was only 2 years old, but as long as the bucks were there, there was no lower age limit. So Dorothy also was attending kindergarten with me, along with such well-known Olympians as Goosey Etzel and Bert Giles and so on. Well, I think it snowed a lot more when I was young than it does now. And on this one particular day, we had a heavy fall of snow. There was to be a party at the kindergarten. Mr. Bruce had a Dodge high-wheel touring car, and he thought it would be fun to tie a bobsled on behind the touring car and tour around picking us all up to go to the party. It was very cold. My mother dressed my little sister Dorothy very warmly, and as a final gesture of motherly concern, she pulled a pair of heavy black wool socks over her shoes and stockings. Well, to make a long, tragic story short, on rounding a curve on the way to the kindergarten, Mr. Bruce lost control, the bobsled tipped over, and we were all catapulted into a snowdrift where the town grader had pushed it to the side. Everybody got out except Dorothy. All we can see of her are 2 little legs kicking in the snowdrift, and no shoes. None of us remembered that my mother had put the stockings on over the shoes, so I recall spending part of the Christmas party in that snowdrift looking for the non-existent shoes of my little sister Dorothy.
George.
Well, Joe, I didn't come a little bit later than that, and I think what fascinated me most in those days, and I'll go back to Ace Baker, Frank's father, and the Jingle Club. And that was one of the community affairs where everybody got involved. I can remember sitting up there in the Elks Temple and the phones ringing and people would call in and tell them what they would give for different things. And I think the favorite thing was when they wanted Ace Baker to sing. And
No
Ace,
one's ever asked me that.
no, they wouldn't ask you, but they asked your father to sing different songs up there, and they would contribute so much to the Elks Jingle Club. And the other one was Red Lynch and down at the fire department, and the Montmans, and they would go down to Portland and buy carloads of presents, which they would donate to the different people, and they'd put them into packages and sacks and boxes, and they would go all over to anybody that they knew of that needed food or toys or had kids, to make Christmas better for those in the community that weren't so fortunate as some of the rest of them.
Could I add to that, Joe, just a minute? George talking about my father, I have heard this story so many times during his lifetime, but it all had to do with the Jingle Club. I might say, incidentally, that the Jingle Club started too when KGY was just initiated. And at that time, KGY was operated from St. Martin's College. And they were a very strong part of the development of the Jingle Club program, which now is, as true of most things, has become extremely commercial, and you get a list from the State Department of Social and Health Services or something of this type. But at that time, as George points out, we not only would gather the food and the toys, etc., but then we had an old gymnasium in the Elks in the early days, and in that whole gymnasium floor, we would be sure that all boxes were duly packed and ready for delivery, and then we would deliver them to the people who were in need. I say we, I meant the Elks, not me, but my father was very instrumental in that time, and he always told a story that he never got over, and you'd have to know my father to realize how he would take this, but he went up to the door for these people that were supposedly destitute, and he rapped on the door, and he noticed, my father noticed that there was a gentleman in there ironing a silk shirt. Well, you didn't see silk shirts on men very often in the 20s or early 30s, and Dad said many times that he thought something was haywire. And so he knocked again, and this gentleman came to the door, and my father said, well, I'm here from the Jingle Club, and I brought you presents and food. And this fella said, take him to the back door, please. And that didn't set so well with my father, but you were supposed to take all those things to the back door before it would be allowed in. So I've heard that story so many times that it takes all kinds, in other words. Bah humbug.
That wouldn't be so unusual today.
No, I suppose not. Not for the silk shirts, anyway.
Well, what, George, wasn't it part of the fundraising for the Jingle Club that got you into a can-can dancer's outfit prancing on the stage?
Well, that was later on.
We ran a picture of that in the Olympia News, and we got a letter from a lady that said, of course, they were all very short-skirted and all very male, and she said, you know, I thought they all looked terrible except George Warren. He has fine legs.
Yep, you had to be 250 pounds in order to get into the
Well, George,
into the Rosebud Chorus.
for the purpose of the program, who all was involved in that particular group?
Well, there was Howard Grimm, Big John Hendricks, Roy Moen, Roy Kelly, Roy Baker, Jim Whistler.
Emil?
Who?
Emil Johansson?
Emil Johansson, yeah.
Nobody had to ask, where's the beef?
No, I didn't have to ask that.
Oh,
Yeah, we had many requests. George used to put on the music and the sound and
Yanis?
the dancing, George Yanis, and then the dance, what was the girl that used to teach dancing up there in the Eagles? We used to rehearse day after day on that thing. Then when we got up there, we'd forget every blessed thing we knew.
There was one Christmas that it snowed, and it was about, 3 feet, and it stayed a couple of weeks, you remember? I remember it because it was 4 young boys They didn't have dryers in those days, and our place smelled like a wet goat ranch for a long time, but the kids loved it.
That was in the late 40s?
About 1950, right around in there.
About
49,
there.
50.
Yeah, the kids were small.
And they let out the State House early and everybody went home.
Yeah.
And those that
Yeah.
didn't get off early didn't get home.
And all the lights were out, and we used kerosene,
You couldn't get up and down the streets.
and no.
And then the big argument was in those days is when you cleaned the streets, did you put the grader and did they push it to the curb or did they pile it up in the middle of the street? And if you pushed to the curb, you just couldn't get a car in there and get it out. If you pushed to the center of the street, you couldn't get around anything.
Well, our hill was the first one they closed, Bigelow Hill. But when there's snow, they came straight down our alley. And after the snow would clear, I could go out there and pick up old crucifixes and wallets and all kinds of things the kids had lost in our backyard. And so we didn't care too much.
Well, I think one of the things I remember about that time was when all the churches used to be downtown.
That's true.
The Lutheran church and the...
And they all had bells.
They all had bells, they all played them. And between the Baptist church and the Episcopal church used to be alongside of it. And the Lutheran church was down there behind the Olympia insurance brokers. And the Methodist church used to be just up the hill there a little bit.
Yeah.
But it seemed like everything was congregated downtown. Now they're scattered all over town.
Of course, Christmas is a Christian celebration, and churches play a prominent part in our tradition of Christmas. The bells were very much a part of downtown Olympia in Christmases past. What else do you remember from Marianne from Christmas in Olympia?
Well, I speak as a Methodist. And the church that was on the corner of 5th and Jefferson was built in 1900 as a one-story building. And then it got to be about 1920, and they had to do something, and they couldn't dig a basement because the ground is so sloppy downtown. So what they did was dig about 4 or 6 feet down, so when you went to the basement, you stepped down a few steps, and then when you went to the first floor, you went up about 20 steps. Well, it got sloppier and sloppier, and high tides would come, and the soil was wet, and eventually there was a heavy lady in our congregation who put her foot through the kitchen floor, and we had to get her out. And they had a monthly party for the ladies to come and empty the bottom drawers in the kitchen, dump them out, and wash the pots and pans. And that was just before the earthquake completely destroyed the church. And we had plaster, 5, 6 feet tall. But what I remember the most is it was the plan of a church sanctuary where it was a square sanctuary, but you kind of went down to one corner. I think they call it a Detroit plan or something. So here would come the ushers down the 2 aisles. We had 2 aisles instead of 1. And they insisted on walking in cadence. And the whole place would just go, you know. And we hoped there wasn't too much money in the plates or we would have been in the basement. That's one thing I remember about that old church.
Well, I've been an Episcopalian since 1933, I believe. And I remember the old church, the old little Episcopal church, contrary to the present structure, which is on 19th and Capitol Way. The old church was down on about 9th and Washington Street. I believe the Baptist church is there now, and they have added to it considerably. But in those early days where I was confirmed and baptized, it was such a delightful little church. It was very personal and very close-knit, seemingly so. And all the cushions were red cushions on the pews. And the wood carving within the altar area, and all the fixtures were of considerable beauty. And come Christmas time, when we'd go normally to the midnight service when we became old enough, it was a glorious response to Christmas to be able to go to that little church. I'm not negative in anything about the present church, but it's more new and it's modern and so forth. Where in this little church was so personal and so much a part of my family's life that I'll long remember that as a part of Christmas.
I remember that church, and it brings back a very striking memory that stayed with me. I believe it was at a Christmas service. I was in something called the Brotherhood of St. Andrew. Maybe you were a brother.
Maybe I was.
It was the boys' organization of St. John's. And at that time, Kate Stevens Bates, the daughter of the first territorial governor of Washington Territory, who came here 4 years after the town was dedicated, 1854. Still very active, and she'd married an old gentleman named James H.S. Bates.
Better known as Jimmy.
Jimmy. And he would start walking at a faster pace than Kate, and you usually, well, sometimes she'd be a block or two behind him. My father used to enjoy stopping and giving her a lift in the car and leaving James H.S. on the sidewalk. But this one particular time, they came into the church and were, I believe, going up for communion, and poor Kate stumbled and fell out into the nave of the church, and James H.S. stepped right over her and received his communion while she's lying on the floor.
She was a little tiny lady.
Little
Very
tiny.
small, very tiny. And she would just walk along with little short steps, and no Jimmy'd be 10 yards in front, and they'd walk all over town.
During the war, that very same church, there was a young soldier who was a chaplain's assistant, and he used to come to our house. You remember how we adopted a soldier? And he was an organ repairer, pipe organ. And that church had a remarkable organ. It was all wood. And this boy took us at midnight one night up to that church. He had the key. He was repairing the organ. And even in his heavy army boots, he played the most gorgeous music. It was Handel's water music and all this at midnight in that beautiful little church.
Well, I think that's one reason I enjoyed it. Maybe you remember this, Mary Ann, but my mother,
Was she the
Opal Baker,
organist?
was the organist for years and years
Oh,
in that
my.
church. And before 1933 or whenever it was specifically that I was confirmed, I think Mother played in the United Churches, so then I went to the United Church. And I think she played in a couple of others when I was smaller, and I would go wherever she was playing.
Did you
see?
pump?
And I'd have to do all of these things, but once she got settled in the Episcopal Church,
Most of them had a
I had
bar.
to join up.
They used to have a long bar that you'd have to pump up and then hold. And my brother did that behind a curtain for years
Yes, that's true.
till they electrified them.
It used to be a community custom to have Santa Claus arrive at Sylvester Park, which was originally the town square. They finally, John Miller Murphy, publisher of the Weekly Washington Standard, was constantly complaining about the Olympia cows. Everybody had a milk cow, and they'd just turn them loose. There was no leash law for cows, and they'd gather in the park or town square, and they also ate a lot of John Miller Murphy's shrubbery. He claimed that they were total criminal class of cows. They were smart enough to pick the most sophisticated lock on a gate. But that's why they built the wrought iron fence around the town square, which now is around your house, Mr. Bigelow.
Relics.
Keep the cows out. But I believe it was in 1929, the Olympia Airport had been opened, and Leon Titus, the Ford dealer, was one of the early air enthusiasts. He and others formed an air transport company, and Ross Dye, who's still one of the old-timers around, was one of the very first to fly in with his own monoplane. And they decided it would be a great thing to have Santa Claus fly in to the airport for publicity purposes, and then they'd whisk him to Sylvester Park. And at this time, the Depression was beginning to creep west, and times were getting a little hard. And there wasn't a kid in town that missed that free handout that year. And when they saw Santa arrive, they just went totally out of control, tore his sack away, started throwing the packages around, chased him into the old fish pool. You remember, had the big goldfish in it? And he stood in the fish pond while the police department came and got our little moppets under control. I think shortly after that they abandoned that custom. It was
You know, traditions are such an important part of Christmas.
Another thing that's changed, Joe, at least I believe it has. In the early days of my youth, everybody went out and cut their own tree or got their own tree. You didn't go down here to the corner and buy them, and especially at today's rates, it's rather an expensive luxury. But I remember that all through my young days, we always went to Hawks Prairie to get them. To the left of the freeway primarily, but we all went to Hawks Prairie to get a tree, and the reason was that they had the most beautiful jack pines of any place in the area. As you might remember that, Marianne. And you see very few jack pines anymore, but they stood up much nicer, and they did not bend over with the ornaments and so forth. And so we would very often, practically every year, go to Hawks Prairie. And now, when you see Hawks Prairie, there are no trees there available.
Well, you can remember, can't you, when they used to plant the Christmas trees downtown during the Christmas season, put them on the corners of each thing?
Oh, yeah.
And the kids would take them and put them out in the middle of the street. Old Cap Hayes would be chasing us around town trying to catch us, moving those things out in the middle of the street. He couldn't handle them by himself, and you have to get somebody else to help him put them back on the corner.
Well, you know, each of us as family units have traditions as well that we keep alive. I know my wife every Christmas morning makes fresh cinnamon rolls and applesauce. She gets the apples and throws them in, and by the time I'm up and about, boy, the smell just makes you hungry, even if you're just eating, you'd eat it. I was going to ask you about some of your family traditions, some of the things that...
Well, with 4 boys, you've got a lot of things happening on Christmas. And it used to be that they would come and jump in our bed, all 4 of them, to open their gifts. And I remember one remarkable Christmas where we thought it'd be smart and economical to put crackers in their socks as well as sweet things, you know. And they did. We had cracker crumbs in the bed for months. It's awfully hard to get out. But another one that is still functioning, I think some of these jokes, the more they're repeated, the better they are. Our second son was in the Peace Corps in Ethiopia for almost 7 years. And when he came back, he had somehow access to lead weights, and he had one that, well, it looks like a Christmas tree ornament, but it's solid lead. So it's always with the Christmas decorations, and it's the last thing I get out, floor underneath the Christmas tree. And then when John comes along, he points to the nearest stranger and said, "Look, one of them has fallen down. Will you pick it up?" And then they all laughed because here he is trying to hoist this thing. It must go 6 pounds, something like that. And that's a tradition, I think.
Sure.
A lot of fun.
Those traditions are fun. I've often thought I help a little, Gene wrap the packages and so forth. And of course, when we were all young, there was no such thing as Scotch tape, and I don't know how we ever lived without that to prepare the packages, because you had to use some rather beautiful type of cord and string and so forth, but you couldn't just slap that Scotch tape on. And in those days, and Gene and I still carry that out quite a bit, is that the paper that was available to wrap packages is much more beautiful today and much more expensive and different than what we utilized in the old days. And I remember for years and years, in my home, my mother always used red tissue. It was always red tissue. Every package under that tree was red tissue. And so we still use a lot of red tissue in my family. And I just about had a fit with my number 3 child here. Back, we sent some packages to her up in Bellingham, and we did them in red tissue. And Barb says, "When are you and Mother ever going to learn that there's something beside red tissue to wrap packages in?" Well, So I had to explain to her it's been around for a long time. Well, then, of course, she felt very chagrined and said anything. But at that time, it was a wonder that we were still using the red tissue.
You know, it's hard to translate things from now to then and vice versa. Kids don't realize that there was a time before plastic. Do you remember celluloid?
Oh, yeah.
We had some celluloid, which was certainly biodegradable. It disappeared just as you looked at it practically. You remember Bakelite, which superseded celluloid? And now plastic that won't even go out with a tide. It comes in again the next day 6 feet down the beach. But things persisted then because they were well made and there were fewer of them. I don't know what to think of the ring of plastic toys around the tree. We didn't have so many things, and I think we appreciated them a whole lot more. My favorite thing of all time that I got for Christmas my whole life was a little hand-carved horse about that big of wood. And we moved, and I lost it and cried for weeks.
Speaking of the things, I take my family and shopping. We go to South Town Center, we go to Capitol Mall. What were some of the shops like, and what were some of the best shops to shop at in Olympia's past?
I don't remember that we went to shops too much. You see, during the Depression, you didn't buy anything, you made it. What was it? Use it up, wear it out, make it do or do without. And when you got something, it was like my father, who one time, my big Christmas present was a doll bed he made. And my mother made a quilt to go on it. I mean, these things meant a great deal. And my brother got the stuff to make for Christmas, to make a monoplane. And that meant a great deal to him. Later, he had it coming down on a string into an aerodrome. Remember aerodromes? And I caught it one day because I disturbed the whole thing, didn't mean to. And he had the ground all padded out to make an airfield. We didn't buy things. It was like years and years before that. If you bought bread, you were rather rascally in your character. There was something missing. You made bread. You didn't go to the store and buy it.
And if the monthly grocery bill exceeded $30 for a family of 4, your mother felt that she was a very bad housekeeper.
And she never let people know how much she spent in that case.
$1 a day for the whole
But
family.
yeah, and we didn't starve. I mean, but I think people tend to forget that this commercial Christmas shopping binge is a fairly recent development. I went through the old Olympia newspapers at one point, and I think it was about the World War I period that I was able to find the first newspaper ad in an Olympia paper directed at Christmas shoppers, and that was for Mottman's.
Mm-hmm.
So, as you said, a lot of the stuff was made, dolls, doll blankets, beds, slingshots.
Leather pillows
Yeah.
that were tooled, and picture frames that were quilted. They have those nowadays. But people put time and thought into them, and it wasn't that it was a grand thing. It was something that showed you cared for them.
There was love went into
It
those
was.
items, not
Yes,
just
that's true.
a credit card.
Yeah.
Bringing up Mottman's, I'm sure you all remember,
Oh, yeah.
if you were here, that Mr. Botman, who ran the store with his family, he had numerous members of his family in the store. But then we had a little alcove wherein he sat all day long. He could look down all over the first floor and this type of thing. And they had big wire baskets,
I remember.
about like this and about like that. And if you bought something in the store, that article, whatever it was, would go in that basket along with a sales slip and would go up to Mr. Mottman before
pulled a long handle.
yeah, you pulled a long rope type of
And it
thing.
went up to the ceiling.
It went clear up to his so-called office. He'd double check it, and then he'd okay it, and then come back down, and get your package.
Do you remember that pair of long johns that were tacked to the front of his
always,
office?
always.
They must have been there for 20 years at
That's
least.
right.
We always
And the elevator in the store was something to scare you to
Oh,
death.
yeah, that's why they had the ramp, I think. Our
John
kids
Martin.
all got their shoes there, 4 boys. Every 6 weeks, we were buying shoes, and we always were promised by Mountains we got the 1,000th pair free. And then they went out of business shortly before that. I know why.
Well, Harris's, I mentioned that earlier too. That was up on Capitol Way, approximately where Geo Guy is at the present time. That's the name of the 5 attendants up there.
Right there.
But anyway, Harris's was right in there, and they also had a kind of a gimmick. If you bought something in Harris's, they had little boxes about like this, and you gave your money to the sales clerk. The slip went in, the money went in, and then it had all these wire tracks all over the place, and it ended up in the office upstairs someplace, and the change was all made up there, and then it came back down, and you had to wait for that little box to get back down there, and then you got your change, and you could take your stuff home.
Never could figure how they powered those things.
But then, Gordon, I'm sure that you were guilty of a terrible sin during the days of the trolley cars going up the West Side Hill, when you used to wax the tracks so that the cars could not get up there, the trolley cars.
No, I never did that. I was up in the
Halloween?
south end, but one time we did steal some
I don't believe that.
torpedoes. You know, the warning torpedoes from the railroad? And we figured out the little Bernie one-man safety cars that were running had just 4 wheels, you know, midships. And we made careful calculations, figured where each wheel would be, and put the torpedoes in that approximate location. And when it hit the torpedoes, it lifted it off the track.
Oh, derailed it?
Very, very angry motorman.
Oh, my.
I felt guilty because the streetcar was my babysitter when I was very young. I was fascinated by streetcars. I was going to be a streetcar conductor, no doubt in my mind. And at that time, we lived on Main Street, Capitol Way, just adjacent to Maple Park. And if they wanted to get rid of me for a while, they'd wait until Mr. Morford's streetcar came along. He was a conductor who was a friend. And my grandmother or mother would take me out, give me a nickel, and I'd give it to Mr. Morford, and I'd ride back and forth between Tumwater and Olympia. I would have stayed all day until somebody came out, stopped the car, and took me
Was it
back.
an open car in those days?
In the summer, they had
Oh, it had
open
both.
streetcars. Delightful memory going out to the old ballpark at about where Sunset Life is now, and watching the Olympia Senators and the Timber League.
That's correct. Well, we're getting off of Christmas, I suppose, but I thought one of the unique things of my early days within the city and the usage of various property and so forth was they always had the carnival right in the middle of the Capitol grounds, right where about the Tivoli Fountain is. American Legion always put on the carnival every year, and here's the beautiful Capitol behind it, the legislative building, and there was no grass or flowers of park-like type at that time. It was a big hayfield, and they'd come in and they'd throw all the sawdust down, and here comes the carnival. And one of the big things was Olympia High School and the Capitol Apartments were right across the street there. And there was a switch for the streetcars right in front of the high school, right there by the Capitol Apartments. And everybody could get on the trolley cars and come down to that area, a direct ride to the carnival on the Capitol grounds. And that went on for a number of years until they finally acquired enough funds, I guess, within which to put some lawn in.
Of course, Santa Claus is an important part of Christmas. Without Santa, a lot of the kids would be a little sadder at Christmas time, I guess. George, maybe you remember some of the more notable assistants Santa has had in the Olympia area.
Well, Joe, there were a number of them that used to come in and they'd be Santa Claus for a few years, and then somebody else would take their place. They used to come in different ways. There were always the Chamber of Commerce figuring out something that was different to bring them into town, either in a sleigh or even a helicopter or whatever they could get that would be different. And one of the earliest ones I remember was Van Riper. He used to be quite a man around town, but every Christmas he was just as faithful as could be. He was always out there with his Santa Claus suit and loved the kids and handed out the candy and the rest of it. And then there was Ted Little, that was Smith Troy's assistant up at the Attorney General's office. Ted was a little fella. He didn't look much like a Santa Claus, but he was dressed up and he made a very satisfactory Santa Claus because he liked people and talked to them. But I think the one that most of us would know today would be Freeman Rose. He used to be down on the Olympia Police Department and is still one of the outstanding Santa Clauses that goes to the different stores and different places and the rest of it. But I think the one that I remember best of all was Benny Bean. Now, Benny was of the Jewish religion, and while we were all celebrating Christmas, they didn't particularly celebrate it as we did. And you could always get Benny to come on out to the house and rap on the door with his ho, 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 you know, out there, and hand the presents out to the kids as he went around. And the only trouble was, in those days, the streets weren't marked quite as well as they are today. Just like on the Jingle Club, Frank, we had a heck of a time finding these houses out there to take the different boxes of stuff out at Christmas time. Mud and dirt roads, and we'd get lost, and we had a heck of a time with the car to get stuck out there and the rest of it. But old Benny, he did a heck of a job for us, and for several years there, he was the most faithful Santa Claus we had around town.
It's kind of ironic that Benny made a good Santa Claus, and the Olympia Supply Store Santa Claus was frightening to children. He was, as I recall, tall, cadaverous, and looked like he should be wearing a hood and carrying a scythe instead of a package of goodies. We brought our two little girls down to see Santa Claus, and they took one look at him and said, "If that's Santa Claus, we don't believe in him." So we had good ones and bad ones, I guess.
Good ones and bad ones.
I suppose the one that is most outstanding in my memory was in the Christmas of 1944, when I was in a hospital in England. And if a person ever felt lonely, that was a good place to do it. And at that time they were trying to get presents to the various fellows over there in the hospitals, and every time anyone would get a present, it was shared on the whole ward, because we did not know how many we were going to get. And it was such a relief to have something from home in that regard, that it was a wonderful thing to be able to share what little we all had that got through the mails in one form or another, from cookies on up, you know, to various foods primarily. And I don't think there's any question but what the various fruit cakes, I've never had one since. We had enough